Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Welcome to our second episode of the Ideal Gentleman series, where we talk about our own efforts and striving to try and be a better husband, to try and be an ideal husband. So, we're going to start off the episode with Tilawat of the Holy Quran. So, I request Ajib Bhai if he could please recite a few verses of the Holy Quran.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين.
Ameen. Jazakallah. So last time we ended on a point about a hadith of the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam on how marriage completes half your faith, and we mentioned that we would continue that in the next discussion. So hopefully by the end of today's episode, we'll talk about that as well. But what I wanted to start off today was on the subject of culture. And again, we're talking about that theme of expectations versus reality. What were our expectations about trying to be an ideal husband before we got married? And then what was the reality that we found afterwards? So, culture is something that definitely plays a part when a person is thinking about how I can be a good husband after I get married. A lot of people think that if I'm from a certain culture, like if I'm raised in an American or Western culture, then will I be able to be a good husband to someone who's from a Pakistani culture? Is there going to be a language barrier? Is there going to be a cultural barrier, misunderstandings? Would I be able to click with that person? So, how much does culture play as in the role of affinity when it comes to having that compatibility? So, what were some of our expectations? I mean, that's kind of the question. What were some of our expectations before getting married, and then did we find those expectations to be part of the reality of trying to be an ideal husband? So, what has been our experience about that? So, what do you guys think about that?
I think some of the expectations of just like culturally, like a Pakistani husband, or just having the idea of like, oh, Pakistani men like can't be expressive or can't show any type of emotion, and they're very just like, I'm going to work. When I come home, there better be some food on the table, and just kind of like hearing like those type of stories, or just seeing those examples in some of family members, or just around the community. You kind of feel like you don't, at least like I didn't want to be that type of a husband where I'm like, I'm just gonna work, and like my expectation is when I come home, like my wife is like, at the time in the beginning, she was still studying, so it's like, oh, when I come home, there better be food on the table. Like that's like that. I didn't want to be that guy,
Yeah.
So it's like
So it's
you
like it
have to
sounds like
really
there's like a
fight that.
this sounds like there's like a lot of negative perception there, which is one of the things that actually the whole reason why we're doing this show, which is that when it comes to initial falling in love, there's always positive things about that, whether it's Eastern or Western culture. But like you're talking about, when it comes to long-term relationships, then with so much divorce rate here in the West, when people talk about marriage and then having children, there's like this negative perception of like being miserable, or like somebody who's been in a long-term relationship, they're not that happy. So also with that Eastern type of thing as well, that like after after some time in the relationships, it becomes kind of rigid. So I mean that cultural thing of what you observe based on, and I think I've observed to that to an extent as well, from coming from like a South
Think
Asian
like culture
background.
is pretty important. I think, for me, expectations wise, like I really wanted somebody that culturally we can kind of vibe on, because it's really hard for us. Where we have a certain way of living, we have a certain understanding of how we live and stuff. So if you're gonna kind of get married outside in a different country, it might be harder to kind of connect. So for me, I mean, I had the expectation that I wanted somebody local in America, at least, just because if we were both born and raised in America, we could understand each other more easy. So that would make the beginnings more easier to kind of start with, instead of having to have that long period of time to try to figure out each other's culture background and then grow from there. So it's much easier to start it off if you have the same kind of culture and understanding and
So
background
do you
than it
think
would
that
be like if you.
expectation held true over time?
Yeah, definitely. I think that it really helped because if you don't have to spend time explaining, why is it this way, why is it this way, kind of walking them through that type of lifestyle. So it's much more easier for somebody to kind of, I mean, especially for me, for example, I'm not talking about everybody, but for me, it's much easier to kind of have somebody, in the same kind of life path than it is to kind of, bring somebody from the outside and teach them all that.
Hmm. I mean, what has your been experience been, Ashraf, on that point of culture, like from expectations beforehand and then after marriage?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up around a lot of different cultures. I mean, I'm Morocco. I grew up in North Africa. I went to an American school. My teachers were all American. I spent a lot of time with the Europeans. Had a lot of friends from the Middle East and all kinds of like ambassadors, kids, and stuff like that. Also in that area, because like they're the ones who speak English in Morocco. So I've been around a lot of cultures. I think that shaped my view that there's a lot more, that I was very open to other cultures. But yeah, I mean, I think there's things like, you want to have the same sense of humor, but that can translate across cultures too. And you want to
Hmm.
like feel like your personalities are compatible. So I don't know, culture is not a big thing for me. I feel like I can kind of navigate different cultures.
Yeah, I mean, when I think back to my expectations, I feel like it did play a strong role. Like I do remember thinking that, okay, I do not want to get married to someone who's not from my culture, someone like, for example, someone who's from Pakistan, who's just immigrated, because I did feel like there was a barrier. Like in Jamia, for example, the guys who are recently from Pakistan, they would usually hang out with each other, and then we who were raised here. So, I mean, there's a language barrier and there is a bit of a cultural barrier, and that definitely does play a role. Now, the question is, does it actually make a real effect on happiness? I'm not so sure about that, because I can see that communication is definitely one issue. But on the other hand, a lot of times, those who have immigrant parents, the way we end up communicating with our parents is that we speak in English to them, they speak in Urdu, or, whatever that language is to us. And 100% no problem in the communication. You only have trouble communicating when you have to speak in a language you're not comfortable with. So
Yeah.
in my,
I,
yeah.
I think in the beginning, when you're just looking to get married, I think that culture can be seen as important because you don't know this person, you don't really know what it's going to be like, and so you want to kind of have a good starting off point. Well, like, okay, at least I know we have some of the same culture, maybe the same pop culture, maybe the same kind of sense of humor, maybe some of that. I think that once you get past that, it's easy to build your own culture within that marriage. Like you said, I mean, I have friends who don't speak the same language as me. Really, it's their second or third language. But sure, is there a language barrier at first? But you kind of develop your own friendship with them, and you get past that culture. So I think it's the
Yeah,
same thing with a marriage. You can develop your own culture there.
yeah, I think it definitely is like comfortable, like what you're comfortable with too, right? Like going outside of like a culture that you're like comfortable with, or like that you've interacted with. Like for you, like Ashraf, like you were around a bunch of different cultures, but for someone who like was only in America, or like only stepped foot out of the country like once or twice, like there's like this subconscious fear of like you don't want to take that risk with something like as big as marriage. So like you just kind of want to, I mean, hate to say it, but play it safe, like what you're kind of used to. So like for example, my wife is from Australia, so like although it's like somewhat like similar pop culture and stuff like that, like there were like some things where like I thought they were the same and then they weren't. So like
Mm.
and like that kind of like the expectation was like, oh, like it'll be the same, but then there were things that were different, like just like on like a humorous note, like she worked at Apple when she or before she migrated here, and she was just like, yeah, I work at Apple. And I was like, oh, snap. Like, oh, like people say that all the time. And she was like, oh, snap. But over there, oh, snap, man. Oh, me too. And I was like, and so she was under the impression that I worked at Apple too. And I was like, no, no. I was like, no, what is happening? Like, it wasn't
Mm.
until, much later, it was like, okay, like there's like these nuances where like you're comfortable with the nuance, then, that's something you'd want to do.
Yeah, that reminds me just like from Urdu, because my wife, she's like she was raised in Germany, but in Germany, since German is such a hard language to learn, so the older generation retains Urdu and teaches it to this next generation much better. Like here in America, since English is, just such an easy language, you know it from South Asia and everything. So the next generation, we barely know Urdu, but in Germany is different. So she has a much better understanding of Urdu and its words. And like, that point you made of misunderstanding on words, like there's some words that, from a classical Urdu or academic perspective, you just use them, you read them in a book. but it's kind of seen as a profanity in Urdu in today's Urdu. So I would just like casually use a word like that, and then it would just turn
Give me
into
an
like it
example.
would just be really funny for her. And then afterwards, I would realize, okay, I didn't know it was like that.
I was gonna say you got to give an example of one of these textbook
Yeah, no,
curse
I don't want
words.
to go into examples. Yeah. But no, definitely from my
But that's
experience though,
interesting.
from sorry, go ahead, Saud. Yeah.
No, I was gonna say like maybe something like so you're saying that you married in Germany. So how was that cultural difference for you? Like were you willing to marry somebody like a non-Pakistani if it came to it, or was that something that you were looking for?
So I feel like we all have an affinity for those people who are similar to us. So we just have a like, just generally there's, or at least I felt there's an affinity to marrying in your own race and your own culture and your own language and everything like that. But then also like there's wanting to find someone who matches your principles best, because the more we confine our search, the less chance we're going to find as much of a compatible match. So I was a little bit worried about that. But when what I saw, for example, in Jamia is that, my wife's brother, he was in Jamia, we were in the same class, we were classmates, but he wouldn't hang out as much with the Pakistani guys as he would with like, the American born confused desis. We're just all confused culturally. That's our reality. We're not really, American in that full like cultural sense of the word. We have, like the culture that we get from our parents as well. But I mean, that's what I found in marriage as well, that from a cultural perspective, I think, those who are raised in the West, they are mostly have that kind of, like Western way of thinking. And I didn't find too many barriers there. A little bit of language barrier there was in the beginning, because my wife's first language is German and then Urdu and then English. But like I said, I mean, yeah, you're right that there is a few barriers you have to overcome in the beginning, but once you overcome them, then it's just like anything else. I didn't feel any difference after that. I didn't find the reality to be as important as the expectations made it out to be. That was my experience when it came to culture. But that was just my experience. I mean, like in that sense. I mean, I don't know. What did you guys? Because when I was in the marriage process, I was almost to the point of like, I do not want to get married to somebody who's outside of my culture because it's just not going to work. I mean, that's such a naive thing to think, but like it just seems so important at that point before getting married. There's just these kind of random factors when in the expectation phase they seem so important, but then afterwards, while they are relevant, you can't completely disregard it, but it's not nearly as important as you would think it is.
I agree.
Yeah. I think in general, the things that make us human are more important than the culture. Because now I'm sure you relate to your wife on many more levels than you would have initially thought. Because at first you just saw her as not American, from a German Pakistani background. I don't really know much about that, but now you see her more as your wife, the with her personality, her character, her traits. You don't really see that at first. I think it has to do with that abstract when you're like just talking about a non-American, different culture person in the abstract. You put your own things into it, but when it's an actual person and then that person becomes your wife and you start building that, then it's not about, you don't really see her every day as like, oh, that's the German Pakistani lady. It's more like, oh, you know her, tendencies and stuff,
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I think that's why also, in that hadith where it's mentioned about why people get married to someone, family is mentioned. And also in commentary of that hadith, the point is made very clearly that it doesn't mean that you don't take these things into account, but it just means that we don't make them the first priority. So like coming from the same tribe, the same family, that same kind of background, that is something that can be taken into account. There should be kufu of a type of similarity there, but it's not like an overarching reason. But when we're talking about expectations before, so another thing that's interesting is finances, is money, because that's something that's so important. Like I was just saying, how culture seems so important before I got married. So when you're in the rishta process, one thing that seems really important is your income, how much money you make. And it's very easy to think based on this, now this is going to decide how good of a husband I can be. Like, so if I don't have enough money, I'm not going to have much rishtas available to me, which means my pool is smaller. I'm not going to be happier. The guy who's like, a doctor is like really earning well, he has many more people he can choose from. He's going to have a more happy, financially stable life. He's going to have that Instagram marriage, those smiling pictures with, a compatible person with, good vacations, nice car, nice. So that's kind of it's understandable if somebody has expectations like that, my being a good ideal husband is related to my financial stability, because it matters so much in the rishta nata process. So what are those, like, how do those expectations, what is the reality of those expectations? How do they translate into actually trying to be an ideal husband after getting married?
I think the buildup before is really, really big. I think people do like set that like that it's like just becomes this like just this big old thing of like, oh, like you can't start like thinking about getting married. You don't even have a job. You don't even have this. You don't have that. And then you end up in your late 20s or whatever, and then it's like, well, now I have all this, but then you're set in your ways. So like the money thing, at least for me personally, like I didn't even have a job at that, like a job to support another person or anything like that. It was just like, I have faith in what I'm about to do. You know, I'm a wakfino, so my idea was just I'm gonna do what I need to do. And if this person on the other end is like, sure, like this person doesn't have a job, but they have a plan that they're according to, whatever Hazur advises that this is what they're gonna do, then you just go through the
Yeah, that
motions.
expectation
It's
can
like
seem, yeah, that
that
expectation can
money
seem,
thing.
yeah, yeah. I was thinking that that expectation, it can seem so strong that, like you said, it doesn't even seem
It
like
is strong.
you're seen like a child, basically. Like, why are you even thinking about me? You're not even in the category of being a husband or looking for a husband. How can you be an ideal husband
Exactly.
when you're not even a,
I
a
think
man in the full
I
sense of
think
the
that's the
word?
mindset that we gotta break that mindset. Is that, like you said, like people consider, like, act like you have to have this certain amount of money, or you have to have these certain assets to be able to even think about getting married. Like Ajibai was saying, like, I think that we need to break that kind of mindset, because like if you have the right partner, you could have nothing. Like, a lot of people have literally
Exactly.
nothing
Yeah.
to their getting married. And then, but if you have the right partner that is like willing to grow with you, willing to kind of like, kind of take that life journey with you, then all that stuff doesn't really matter. Like in the long
Yeah. Then
scheme of things,
exactly.
you're
And
gonna
You go through that
you're not
struggle. You literally grow through the
exactly.
struggle.
So like, if
Like
you have that faith that, like, don't have that expectation that, oh man, I'm only gonna get married when I have this much amount of money, or I'm only gonna even start thinking on marriage when I have a job or this and that. It's like, just think about the process, and then you could do it together. You can, yeah, and in fact, it actually makes you a stronger couple when you start off with nothing and you grow together, because
Maybe
now
maybe
you
that's
guys are
something.
together.
Maybe that's something that you've learned from experience, though. I mean, the question is, when we were actually in that process, did we actually expect, did we think that if I don't have these things, then am I actually going to be incapable of, am I inadequate as being a good husband, as trying to be an ideal husband? I mean, I mean, okay, so did we have that expectation? Did it change? Or
yeah.
did we have that maturity from the beginning?
I definitely didn't. I think that's the main impediment to early marriage. I think a lot of people would like to get married earlier, or maybe if not like marriage, they're not there to see the marriage, but at least they would like to have some companionship, start that relationship. And I think that money is a big impediment to that. I think that a lot of people think that, oh, I want to be a doctor, which means realistically, I'm not really going to start making money till I'm 30, which means marriage is out of the question until I'm 30. And that's a big obstacle for a lot of people. It was for me. I was thinking that, uh, I'm a student. I'm an international student here. I need to first finish my degree. Then who knows if I'll find a job? Will I find someone to sponsor me? This is that. And so like that was a big question for me for that stopped me from thinking about marriage earlier. But at the end of the day, I was just like, I'm just gonna I'll go for it. I'll try. You don't know if you don't try. And I was unemployed. I didn't have my degree. I didn't have the right to work because of like the immigration proceedings and all that. And I didn't provide. I wasn't able to provide for over a year. Am I going to sit here and say it was nice? No, it was probably one of the tougher periods of my life. But that was a tough expectation. And at first it's not tough, but I think looking back at it now, it's exactly what Saud Bhai was saying, where you're glad to have built something. You're glad to have been able to start at that bottom and kind of work your way up and work your way up together. And you feel like you've been through that experience together. It's not the same as doing nothing and struggling by yourself till you're 30 and then being able to then
So,
marry someone.
so it sounds kind of
When
like,
it
oh,
comes
go
to
ahead,
the
Said.
expectation part of it, I think when you have the expectation part of it, I think I didn't have that expectation either, that I had to make this amount of money to even think about getting married, because I knew, like, like you guys,
It's
like we're talking about it.
I really, I mean, I think in a lot of ways you are an exception, but I think it's conditioned in us. I think that even the Quran says that the man is the provider, that the man is the qawwam. He's supposed, part of it is supposed to be a provider. And I think that in the same way that maybe women are worried about their looks as being their main thing for marriage when it shouldn't be, I think for men as well, I think the money can be a natural one.
I mean, I think that's kind of cool that there are such exceptions to the rule out there. Like, so, like, it just didn't register that, like, me not being financially stable right now would be anything that would diminish from my value as a,
But
as a
but
potential.
I mean,
isn't that how you were, because it's as a walk, like you don't have, for me as well, I don't have this like
Yeah. Oh, sorry. I
go
think you're
in
cutting off a little
knowing
bit,
that
but,
like I'm gonna
yeah. No, I think I think
do
I
it
hear
ends
what
up being
most.
like a, whatever industry I went
Yeah, yeah. No, I think I heard most of what you said. It was cutting off a little bit, but yeah, no, I get what you're saying. So yeah, I mean, I think that is definitely like a valid point, which is that for somebody who's a Waqf Zindagi, and a lot of people who are Waqfina know, I mean, that doesn't really factor too much in directly. It's more about like, am I getting married to this person for the sake of, we share the same objective and we share the same mission. So yeah, definitely for me, like when it was time for me to get married, it was, I mean, it was just, I was a Waqf Zindagi, and I was, I'd passed Jamia, and I was going to be assigned to do work, and I was a Murabbi. So, I mean, what I find funny is that for my wife, the expectation that she had, I mean, she was just looking for somebody who would, maybe help her improve her spirituality, would help her improve in her religious knowledge, and in her pursuit of connection with God Almighty. And naturally, the conclusion that she came to was that I want to get married to somebody who's active in the Jamaat. I want to get married to a Murabbi. So what I find kind of funny is that the impression that she had of me personally before we got married is based on what my general first impression is. I don't come off as that nice of a guy. So she really thought that I'm making a huge sacrifice. I don't know what this guy is going to be like. Maybe I'm going to end up like suffering. But she thought, okay, you know what? I'm doing it for the Jamaat. I'm doing it for spirituality, and I'll make the sacrifice and marry this guy because he's a Murabbi, and it can't be that bad, can it? It didn't turn out to be that bad, but definitely like there you see, even for those people who are Waqfina Zindagi or who are Murabbi, like there is that sort of, even though money is not really there as an expectation, but there is that thing of the spirituality or the Jamaat work or the service of religion that becomes kind of like
don't worry,
your
Murabbi,
value.
I think you're a really nice guy.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, I think I think your story is very different because I think you're going in with the mindset that money is not going to be one of the things that is going to be a big point in your life. So I mean,
Yeah.
going into that, it makes it much easier that you can kind of upfront say that this is not going to be a lavish lifestyle. So if that's something that you want,
Yeah.
then take.
And
But
I
no,
think one thing that's interesting to note is that it sounds like we all had different expectations or maybe similar expectations, definitely different realities because we're all different people from different scenarios. But it sounds like money didn't end up becoming a central factor for the marriage. It didn't really matter for whether the marriage itself is going well or not.
Yeah, it
Uh,
isn't definitely a central factor. I think it's kind of like the last point we discussed on culture, which is that we can't discount that it does have some effect, some value. Like, you said, the Quran also says that men are guardians of their home because the one of the reasons given is that they provide for their spouse. If they don't, then it does definitely change the dynamics of the relationship. And I think like a husband who's not able to provide for his family, if he's not ready to mentally adjust to it, it is going to be a struggle. It is going to be a bit of a burden. So it definitely is a factor that can't be discounted. But yeah, I
Yeah,
mean,
but I guess maybe what I was trying to say is more so like I don't think getting that promotion made me any better of a husband or made my marriage any better. I think that's where as long as you reach some baseline of providing, the Quran says provide them of feed them of what you eat and clothe them like how you clothe. Once that baseline is provided, I mean, maybe it depends on the wife as well, but I think the relationship and the marriage doesn't depend on that after that.
so when it comes to being an ideal husband, something that before the marriage seemed like the most important thing in the world, you're saying that it doesn't actually matter at all, or like,
Yeah, and that's not something like I could say that I had as an expectation. Like I said, I was really worried about that. I went through some tough periods, definitely. But I think now looking back, I can say now that like I wouldn't say you can like trace that the relationship or the happiness in the relationship with money at all.
yeah.
I think I read a study somewhere that said that you're only after a certain like a certain salary, your happiness doesn't really go up because like I think it was like $70,000 salary that up until that point, you can struggle. It could cause, a strain. But I think after that, money doesn't really make that much of a difference, because your lifestyle doesn't really change as much. So I mean, depending on different factors, money after a certain point doesn't really matter anymore. I mean, as long as you're, living within your means.
Yeah, I think I read that about as well when it comes to personal happiness. So it'd be interesting to see how that affects family happiness. Because, I mean, there's no doubt that living in poverty does put stresses on an individual, and it puts stresses on a couple as well, where you have to actually work a bit harder on your marriage and work harder on being a husband to then create that ideal situation at home. So, I mean, definitely when it comes to, personal happiness, their spirituality plays a role. I mean, there has to be some level of spirituality that then helps us separate from those materialistic ideals. And maybe they're also, I mean, like trying to be an ideal husband, it does connect with having those priorities in mind when we're getting married. Because if we're materialistic and we have materialistic ideals, then we're naturally going to get married to another materialistic person. You can't have materialistic ideals and standards that you're using as a filter process and then expect to find somebody who's spiritual. I mean, that doesn't really translate. It doesn't make any sense.
And I think when you're talking about that, I think obviously there's a very wide gap between poverty and, this like need for luxury. And that there's a very wide middle ground there of moderation. I think that's where it doesn't matter. I think obviously if you're in poverty, that's going to impact your relationship. If your wife is worried about her kid, if he's getting enough to eat to develop, obviously that's, no one's going to sit here and be like, oh no, it's going to be okay. But I think once needs are met, I think then it doesn't matter as much.
No, that kind of raises another point in my mind, which is that, like, if we think that for me to be an ideal husband, money, I found in my reality, or you found in your reality, the money doesn't really matter, and that beforehand it didn't really need to be a standard. But does that mean that we can actually extend that courtesy to women as well? So, for example, we see in that Rishtanata process that there is more importance that women give when it comes to looking for financial success and stability in a potential husband. And there is more importance that men give when looking for beauty in women. So if financial status isn't really that important in the ultimate scheme of things, then does that mean that beauty also is not that important in the ultimate scheme of things? Like, before we got married, did we think that I have to get married to somebody who's beautiful in order to have that happy marriage, that whatever, that Instagram marriage, or whatever it is, that sort of stereotypical marriage? And so what did we find the reality to be after that? And then also, I guess another question that comes is that, okay, if we found the reality to be different, then were we ready to make that compromise before we got married?
You must spend a lot of time on Instagram, Robbie Sub.
No, I mean, I just use the word, but I don't even have Instagram.
Instagram marriages.
That's one of those words I use where I'm trying to like pretend to be hip with the teenagers, but I don't know what I'm talking about there. So yeah, no, go ahead though.
No, I think that it'd be interesting. I mean, we can ask each other, but for me, I would definitely say, like, I mean, to be blunt, what I thought was important at the start of the marriage. If you asked me, like, okay, you chose this person and you agreed to marry them. What going in, what are the things that you're really happy about? What do you think is going to really make this marriage good? I don't know if those same answers are going to be the same ones, 6-10 years down the line. I mean, obviously, looks and that physical compatibility is a big one initially. I really doubt it's going to make even the top 10 after 5, 6, 10 years. It's not really as relevant. I mean, think about it. Like,
that's why, because, like, you go in the mindset that, looks change. So, I mean, in the beginning, you need that attraction to, kind of go towards that. But I mean, you have to also realize that looks change. I mean, somebody who's looking, very good today can look completely different tomorrow, or, 5 years down the road. So if you're looking for just physical looks, then, that's going to be an issue down the road, because, sooner or later, you always want to, things change. But if you're looking at hearts, or if you're looking internally, then I think those are the things that kind of stay the same, and that will, kind of make it easier for you to kind of have that love and that affection. And
like, logically, it's inevitable. Like, if somebody is getting married for looks, that's his important thing. Then what's going to happen is that after like 10 years, let's say, like after having a few kids or whatever it is, his wife is not going to look, nobody looks the same after 10 years. So his eyes are going to wander. If a woman's husband got married to her because of her beauty, then, like, that's something to be worried about, because even if that woman is the most beautiful woman in the world, is she going to be the most beautiful woman in the world after 10, 15 years? Because if she's not, then I mean, it's not surprising if that guy ends up being the exact kind of guy that he showed himself to be right in that rishta process, which is, to looking for beauty, and then naturally he's going to start looking elsewhere for beauty.
Yeah. I mean, to put it just a very kind of simple way. I mean, if looks and money were that important, you would see, these rich, super rich celebrity marriages have the lowest divorce rates. They
Yeah.
would those prenup lawyers would not make as much money as they do. But they're not. We see that they're not. So there's a lot more that you need in a relationship than looks and money.
What do you think about it, Ajit? What was your experience?
Yeah, I mean, like, I think, like, someone would be lying if they didn't say that, when I reached a picture or whatever ends up like coming across the table, you're not like, well, for example, it's like I came home one day and my mom was like, just had a photo in her hand and was just like, look, and I'm just like, well, okay, well, they made a comment on the photo, and that's like, the expectation is like, it's okay to have that in the beginning, as long as like, one, you're like growing through the relationship, you understand that like everyone is saying, like, beauty is one thing, the intrinsic beauty is going to be the thing that's everlasting, that to understand, like, that, that your wife is here, to understand that love that gets you to understand, love for God, and that entire concept, like, this is the first, like, way in front of you to understand love, so to
And
love, like, what I'm saying. Like,
no, you're absolutely right. And to be honest, like, if you sat here and asked me when I was 20 years old, oh, is it the looks that matter? I would have been like, I mean, if I'm being honest, yeah, of course. Because like I said before, it's just this abstract person. You don't know anything about them. You don't really know much about them. It's an abstract person. Things are the things that are very easily identifiable. Like we talked about the culture, the looks are obviously a big part of it, and that's all you have. You don't have anything else.
yeah,
And
and that's also the culture you're brought up in. I mean, like, in America, like, that's what's like, all the people that you grow up with, non-Muslim people, like that, they're pushing this agenda their entire lives, like, like, oh, the person's got to look pretty, this and that, and they're dating and they're doing this and they're going to school dances, and all this stuff is like constantly happening, and it's just like these ideas are flowing past you, but you understand that, oh, well, one day, I'm going to get married, and like, you can't help, it's subconsciously in you, like, you're going to look at something and take that understanding, like, is this thing beautiful, or is this thing not, is this thing pretty, is this thing not, like, it's okay.
Yeah, it's not just culture. I mean, it's just psychological. And I mean, at the
Yeah.
end of the day, we can't really, I mean, even though we've had an epiphany after years of marriage that it doesn't actually contribute to our trying to be an ideal husband to our wife, or trying to have a good marriage, it doesn't actually significantly contribute, but it's still something that, like, it was important at that time, and it does have some value. So I mean, yeah, definitely. I mean, I guess that's something that we can extend to women as well, that even though a woman might learn after years of marriage that, okay, him being rich or him being this financially stable, it doesn't actually translate into a happy marriage directly. But then, before marriage, it's kind of understandable if a person has those ideals in their mind.
I think a great way to look at it also is like, if someone has hair when they're getting married and then all of a sudden they start losing hair, it's like, are you gonna like not love this person anymore because now they're going bald? Like, it's like,
Yeah,
it's
one
that
thing
is
I
your
don't yeah, one thing I don't get is I see people, they like really go out of their way to work out and get fit before getting married. I never understood that. Why do you want to be like so buff and so fit right when you get married? That's your first impression. You're only going to get fat after that. Why don't you start off fat and then you go crazy working out, and
That's
it's
what I
only
said.
uphill from there.
Once you have a
So
kid, you're gonna get that.
yeah, then it's like, whoa, man, this person transformed.
No, I think that's the mindset, is that, to catch the fish, you have to have, the proper equipment. But once they're stuck with you, then they're stuck with you, right? So
Yeah.
now they gotta live with wherever you are.
Yeah.
But that's the wrong mindset. But
Yeah.
um,
And
that's what
Azam
people
by the
think,
way,
that,
Azam had mentioned here that
to-
we should anybody who's listening to the conversation, maybe somehow on YouTube or maybe through Zoom, they can send in any comments or questions they have. We can address it during the discussion. But on that point, I was thinking also that, like, what was my mindset? What were my expectations before marriage? And again, like, it does matter. And even though at that point, before I got married, I was trying to be mature about it, but it took quite a bit of effort to overcome that vanity. that sort of shallowness. Because when I was doing istikhara, then I thought to myself that if I'm asking Allah Almighty to find me a spouse, to find me a wife who's best for me, then I have to be ready to accept whoever Allah Ta'ala gives me. Now, of course, Allah Almighty, He knows us best. He knows our weaknesses. He's gonna guide us to something that is best for us. He's gonna open our heart to. But still, like, if what I thought, that if Allah Ta'ala shows me and He shows me someone, and He gives me someone as an option, that this is the person you should get, this is your soulmate, and then I end up saying that I don't like the way she looks, I'm going to reject it, that would be a serious thing. That would be disobedience. So what I started doing was that I started actually thinking of the ugliest person that I could imagine, and then thinking, Allah Ta'ala, if this is the person you choose for me as a wife, then I'm willing to do it. And that doesn't sound like it is a pretty hard thing to do, to be in sajda and to think that this is my perception of the most undesirable person. But if that's who you've chosen for me, then I submit and I say that I'm ready for whatever. Now, alhamdulillah, I wasn't put to that trial, but still, like, it took that effort to go through, to overcome those thoughts. I mean, that shallowness. I mean, we might want to pretend, I might want to pretend that I'm not shallow, that like looks weren't the first part, didn't matter a lot. But to overcome it before marriage, to overcome those expectations, it definitely took like a pretty strong mujahida, pretty strong effort.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those where you can look back and like think, how did I not think of that? But I can't see myself 20 years being like, I'd be listening to this right now and be like, all right, I'm not.
But that's what I'm saying. I think
I'm not taking your word for it.
I think that's the reason why. But I think the reason why that's happening is because people are too quick to ask for pictures. I think, like, if you look at the proper way a rishta should work, I think the picture should come maybe in the very last step of a rishta process. Just so, like Rabbi Sab, like you're saying, so you have you don't have that mindset that, oh, this person, I'm only going for the looks. Because if you're like, in discussions and you like the person's heart and personality and their mindset,
I think that's
then
gonna take a
you can
lot
show
of
any picture
retraining. Like you're
know?
gonna have to.
Yeah,
like,
that's what I'm saying. That's something that needs to be kind of inculcated in our youth, is that don't go just for looks, and the looks should be the very last thing, and then if Allah gives you a very good looking person, then that's just your reward for accepting all the good traits in the beginning. So I mean,
the way I think that
that's
could work, because I think like one obstacle in that is thinking that, okay, what if I get to know everything about this person, but then I see the picture, and then it would be really hard to just say, no, I can't go through with this. Because then you would actually seem you would be shallow, and then seem very shallow in front of a lot of people. I think what I
it's
thought
more
at
shallow
that time,
if you do it in the beginning.
yeah,
It's
I
more
mean,
shallow if you do it at the beginning. Oh, I looked at the picture and I rejected it. I didn't even look at the
No, because then
No, I think the other one just could be really awkward. It could just end in a very awkward
you're investing
situation.
some time.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you're investing that time, and then you're like, oh, this person's kind of cool. Yeah, and then the photo comes, you're like, oh no, pull the plug.
To be fair, I do agree with you, Saud, but I think because that's what happens. I think when you have an affection for someone because of who they are, their morals, their personality, that does now then become the focal point. You don't the looks maybe fade off, and that comes to a forefront more. But I think in the case of a rishta, it maybe maybe there's not even that enough time to develop that affection for the personality, and then if the looks are surprising, I think that can cause issues.
The way I thought that it's supposed to work, what you're talking about, so I mean, that's the way it should be. And I think the way it's supposed to work is that you shouldn't be like just filing through pictures, because if you want to see pictures at the first step, that's disrespectful. It's just filing through pictures, and that's shallow, and it's not conducive to actually reaching a good decision. But I think what it should be is that your family meets with her family, and if your sisters and your mom meet her, then they know you. They know that, okay, she's generally within, there's kufuv. Kufuv is that term of equality. The Prophet ﷺ said, don't get married to somebody for their looks, but still there should be some level of compatibility and equality. So you should trust your family members enough that if your mom and your sisters tell you that, yeah, I mean, there's compatibility there. She's not like bad. She's not like a supermodel, but she's not like, so she's within I think you're going to like her. Then when you kind of get to know about her qualities or personality, then when you actually see the picture, then you would know that, okay, my mom likes her, my sisters like her, they think she's a fine looking, she's okay looking person, there's nothing wrong. And then you would kind of project a positive personality onto that face, which would take away from that shallowness where we would just reject somebody for a completely useless reason. So I think that's
everyone's looking for a microwave, they're looking for a microwave result. So, and now in such a fast-paced age, and like the way society is, like nobody wants to bake a cake. They just want press that 30-second, and then and then it's done. I got it, and then keep it moving. So I think that's like a mindset. It's like an uphill battle. Obviously that's the ideal way, but like these kids, they don't think like that. Like these young guys, like, I mean, that's
Yeah.
not the mindset. Like,
And I
it
think
takes a lot.
Yeah,
It's
but
gonna take a
and the
lot.
wouldn't
culture.
you have like a
Sorry, go ahead.
wouldn't you have like a like, what do you call it, fear of missing out type of moment, FOMO moment, if you just rejected a picture just because of the looks? But then what if
I
that
don't
was
think
like
you know.
your
I don't think you know how relationships work these days. It's all swipe left, swipe left.
There's a whole
Yeah, it's
industry
a
so
whole.
based
glad I
on
didn't have to go through that.
Yeah, no, the
Insane.
kids are
Like,
growing up. with that.
literally my situation, I didn't even see, I didn't get a single picture of my wife, or I didn't even, there was no picture sharing at all. Like the first time I saw her was when we went to the house for a rishtabat. So like, the youth these days, they got an uphill battle, like Ajibai is saying, to kind of swipe left or right, whatever you're saying, to pick a match.
Yeah, there. I mean, I guess when people do that, then they suffer the consequences. I mean, like there, you don't have to look too far to see what happens when you go down that road. There was one point that we were talking about earlier. Actually, I wanted to go back to it. So when we were talking about culture, I remember before, Aji, in a discussion we had before, where you were talking about like how there's this perception of wanting to marry somebody who's outside the Jamaat. Somebody had mentioned this in the chat menu as well, and that's not something that I was actually aware of. I mean, that kind of caught me off guard, which was, you were saying that there was a prevalent perception that, like,
Yeah.
that's what we're going to do. We're going to marry somebody. We're going to convert somebody and marry them. I mean, now that we're having
Yeah,
an
like,
issue with it,
yeah. Yeah. I think, like, I don't know whether it was like if it's regional, or whatever the case may be, but at least like in the DC metropolitan Virginia area, like a lot of times when we were younger, going to these like Tarbiyat camps at like extended periods of time, which I don't do anymore, like, and obviously, like, for certain reasons, but essentially, like, it would just be this thing, like, oh yeah, like, I'm not gonna get married to no Pakistani woman. Like, I'm gonna just convert somebody like that, and that it was just like a like mission, like, and like a lot of people would think like that, and like I know multiple people who just had this mindset that like this is what was gonna happen. I mean, even like, I'm not gonna sit here and lie, like, even I had that like thought, because everyone else was thinking like this. It's like, oh yeah, like, it'll just be easy. Like, I'll just convince them that like this is like, this is it, and they'll convert, and it'll be great, and we'll have this like amazing thing, and like
But
just this like stigma.
I'm curious what you think the root cause of that is. Is it that?
I think the root cause of it, I think I know what the root cause is that people have this, I mean, your mindset is basically controlled around the people you're with. So if you're with people that have gone through like horrible marriages, then your mindset is like that. You're going to think that, oh man, these Pakistanis or whoever these people are, they're like bad because, I've seen them. I heard this person did that. I heard this person did that. So now I'm going to avoid that altogether. So then, to avoid that, what are you going to do? You're going to start, looking for yourself or looking outside. So I think if you're surrounded with people that have good, loving marriages, then you're going to think that, yeah, this is the type of marriage I want. So I'm going to look inside and find somebody like that within the community. But if you're seeing people that always have like, divorces or, issues, then you're going to be like, oh, I'm going to avoid that. And I'm going to go look out and do my own thing.
You think the root cause is that if I look outside or look to someone who's not Muslim, that it'll be a better relationship? Because I'm really thinking about this. I wonder if it's like we're talking about culture. Maybe it's that maybe I see myself as more Americanized than the average, like Jamaati person who's like by the book and all that. And maybe if I find someone, I'll be more compatible with them. So I wonder if that was a root cause. Maybe it's looks. Maybe that we're surrounded by all these like norms of beauty, and it's these white, blonde, blue eyes, and that's what I want to go for. I don't know. I'm curious what you guys think.
I think like, well, for example, like and I hate to do it, but I mean, for the Pakistani culture, like, I think growing up, like, thinking that, oh yeah, like, I'm an American, like, yeah, like, my friends are American, like, I'm American, like a lot of the people like that at least I grew up with, like the Muslim like people, the non-Ahmadi Muslims, like, they're already doing these like, certain type of things, like where, they were dating or doing these type of things. So just seeing them and like just seeing like, I guess the Pakistani culture way of things. And I hate to do that because, like, it's not the entire culture, but you know, a lot of our family members left Pakistan for a reason. A lot of negative stuff is associated with like culture stuff that some is true, some is not. So like this the stigma maybe just developing and being like, I don't want anything to do with that. Like I don't want somebody that, one can't speak English properly, one can't, do this or do that, or is only gonna wear Pakistani clothes, like they're not gonna wear like, modest American clothes, like all these like big things. It's like, oh, you'd rather just do something that's easier, which is convert somebody and then just deal with it that way. I mean, like I don't know.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's not something that I personally had. Like, I mean, what you're talking about back in the Tarbiyati camps, like, I mean, I was attending Tarbiyati camps in the Washington, D.C. area, I guess back in like the 90s and stuff. But I don't really remember that coming up so much. And especially in Jamia, it was out of the question. I mean, you got to be with somebody who agrees with you in principle. So, I mean, that's not something that I can directly relate to, of this kind of prevalent idea of wanting to marry outside the Jamaat, of someone who's like, doesn't understand from a growing up background of all the things that are such an important part of our life and our lifestyle. But yeah, I mean, I guess those people who are thinking that way, there must have been enough of them, because now it's actually an issue. It's actually a serious issue that's showing itself in the
Yeah.
Jamaat, and Huzur even like very clearly discouraged it. He said that you should be getting married to Ahmadi girls. This is not like responsible thinking. It's not based on foresight when people think like that, when people make those decisions. It must be because religion is not a priority, though. I mean, like, what we were talking about before, those things that are important to us, we don't compromise on it.
Yeah, I think
Back
so
to the
too.
culture thing. If we think that, okay, my wife might not get my jokes, then we just swipe left. That's it. There's nothing to talk about further here. So, I mean, I guess that happens with religion too, that like, if religion doesn't matter, then if she's not from the same religion, the same community as I am, then it's okay. We can compromise on that because it doesn't matter. I can compromise on anything that doesn't matter to me, but those things that matter, I'm not going to compromise. So I guess it's just a point of priorities at the end of the day.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
definitely.
guess. I mean, and I think and I think it's also based on who you're interacting with most of your days, because like in the masjid setting, you're not really interacting with the opposite gender, but in in work and school and stuff, you're seeing them all the time. So I think they probably justify in their head that, like, "Oh, I see this person, and I know that I've I've seen them along, and I know their personality, so we can make this work." But that's kind of
Yeah.
like the
Uh,
wrong.
and I think, I mean, I think that could play a role, to be honest with you. I think that if we're talking about that root cause, if it is this idea of culture that Ajiba was talking about as well, if all you know of other women is like, you just fill in this blank of this abstract, Pakistani Ahmadi Jamati girl, and it's, all you have is maybe some auntie that teaches Tahir Academy, and that's what you think in your head. Maybe that plays a role, because you don't have that conception of what could an American-born 20-year-old, Ahmadi girl be like.
I
You
think
don't really
when
know.
people do know each other, there's somehow, I do feel like there's a little bit of a stigma that I observed, and maybe I don't know if you guys felt it as well, because in the Maryland area, I remember our Murabi Sahib would hold children's classes all the time, and it would be like both girls and boys children's classes. So growing up, like all the guys and girls, like we knew each other as children. But then as we started getting older, I didn't really see an inclination. I actually saw this kind of maybe aversion, that maybe out of awkwardness, maybe because our families know each other, we know each other, to not get married locally. And I never really understood that logically. I can understand the feeling, though. I do feel like there's a feeling, maybe it's an awkwardness that prevents you from wanting to get married in your local Jamaat to like someone who you knew when you were children, and you kind of had a general feeling for what each other's personality was. But then when you get older, why, when you know people in your local Jamaat, would you go like across the country or across the world, where you're just going off of like some opinions of people who are not even giving you a clear and straightforward opinion? They're just giving you some fluff, positive opinion that is going to turn out to be maybe not that great afterwards.
I think the two reasons. I think there's two reasons for that. Is one is because just for the disclaimer, my wife was from the same Jamaat as me as well, but we didn't know each other. But that was the one of the reasons, is because I think that if people see that you're both from the same Jamaat, then there might be like those thoughts. People think that, oh, you guys liked each other, or you guys had something going on beforehand. So just to avoid that, they try to like go farther out. And secondly, like they have this weird notion that, oh, like, I know this person, so she's like my sister. So they have that mentality that I can't marry somebody I already know, because they're just like like family to me. So they have these like mental blocks in their mind that kind of prevent them from marrying locally. I think, and which is something that we gotta
Yeah,
remove
I
that
mean,
type
but
of mentality.
that also like goes across to like school wise as well, because like I've heard like young like going to children classes and helping with all that, like kids say like being in high school or whatever, like when they work in different groups, for example, study groups or whatever, and it's like at a certain point, especially if your Jamaat is large enough, like you're a lot of these kids are going to go to school with each other, so there's going to be AMD girls and boys in the same class or in the same like university or whatever. So what ends up happening is like I've heard stories of like people just they'll work with like John or Mary, but then like if like Selma's in the class, they're like, oh no, like they avoid like completely like
Yeah, I think that is. I think
that
that
AMD
is an issue.
person. Like
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean,
like that
I'm.
doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make
Yeah,
any sense.
I could definitely see like
Explain
if there
that to
was
me.
an at one if there was like one Amity who's a cashier and another Amity of an other gender coming in, I'm sure they'd go to another aisle to avoid that
No,
interaction.
I
I
think
mean,
I think I've
Yeah, they
actually done
would. They
that.
would do it.
Yeah.
I'm sure they
yeah,
would do it. They
yeah. No,
would.
I
They're
know, I
like, oh
know.
no. They're like, no, mama, we gotta go to number 4. We're not going to number 6. I'm like,
Yeah, yeah,
No,
yeah.
I do remember growing up, like at the grocery store, if you see like another MD, and this is when DC was like very sparsely populated with MDs. Like if I saw an MD at the grocery store, I'd be like not going down that aisle. I need to get out of here as quickly as possible. And I don't know why it was. Like there's no reason for that to be. And
yeah.
Hazur had mentioned, I think in
I think
California,
it's because most of the interactions take place in the mosque with there's no example. I think if you lived in a majority Muslim country or a city or neighborhood that has so many Ahmadis that you see them every day in the market, you see them in school, I think
yeah,
it wouldn't be as big of a problem. But when
yeah.
it's so sparse, your only interaction is so segregated that you feel like that it has to be like that.
Yeah, I mean, Hazur had mentioned, I think in California as well, when somebody asked, he said that if you have someone in your class who's an Ahmadi, opposite gender, if there's Ahmadi guy or Ahmadi girl, you should just interact with them like you interact with anybody else. There should be no barrier there. You should just be equal in your professionalism and your haya in the way that you do it. So, I mean, that's what Hazur said, which is just simple, straightforward, common sense. Just there's no difference in the way that we should treat somebody of the opposite gender when they're Ahmadi as opposed to non-Ahmadi. But definitely, like I do remember, maybe it's just a cultural thing because then when I went to Jamia in Canada, there's such a concentration there that there definitely you are used to seeing Ahmadis around like all over the place. But there's a tipping point where a Jamaat is sparsely populated enough where your heart sinks when you run into an Ahmadi outside. And then there's this tipping point where it reaches a certain number where then it becomes not just a masjid thing, but Ahmadis, there you see Ahmadis all around everywhere. But on that point of like looking for a rishta, I do remember like when I was started off that process of looking for a rishta, I think I did start off to see if I could find someone in the local jamaat, local area and things like that. I think I just at that time I didn't find anyone who was compatible, but in that process there was a little bit of a thing that there's a little bit of an awkwardness that these are families who we know, and maybe it's just more comfortable to avoid that awkwardness to take the reckless decision of just going out in the middle of nowhere. And then the rishta that I ended up having, alhamdulillah, that was also something that was very, very close and personal. I mean, it was my classmate in Jamia. It was his sister. I mean, we were roommates. We lived together in the same room for a year. So then like to then have a rishta with his sister where we're talking about it, and then God forbid if it doesn't work out, if there's a misunderstanding or something, it can definitely create an uncomfortable situation that hits very, very close to home, like in the hostel, the way like that's where you live, that's where you go to the kitchen, you go to everything. So there, I definitely do remember that there was a bit of a barrier there, a fear of awkwardness, but I think that overcoming it is a maturity that we have to have. It's just so immature and childish to say that I'm not going to get married to somebody who's close to my family and close to me just because of a fear of awkwardness, and instead I'm just going to go like get married into a family that I have no proper information about and just kind of jump into head first.
That same exact argument can be used for cousins as well, right? Like, whatever argument you just used, maybe up for marrying locally, you can use that exact the same thing for marrying cousins. People don't want to marry their cousins for that exact reasons because their families are so close and yada yada yada. But I mean, that's just something that we gotta a mindset we gotta take out and
Mm,
be more open to.
yeah. The next point that we had, and now we're coming to the end of our time, but we were supposed to go into a subject of fatherhood. And that's where I wanted to go into that point that you had mentioned last time, Ashraf, which was about, faith completing, the other half of your religion, because I feel like it's a lot connected to fatherhood. So I think that's where we're going to pick up the discussion on next time, because the next question that we do want to talk about, and for those who are watching, in the next time you can join. And then if you have any questions or anything you want to comment during the session, then inshallah we'll address that comment during the conversation. But next session, what we're going to start off in is expectations versus reality when it comes to trying to be an ideal husband and fatherhood. And we're going to talk about two aspects then, not just about what my expectation was on what kind of I trying to be an ideal father, but it was what was my expectation on what kind of a husband I would be after I had children. How would having children affect me as a husband? How would it affect my relationship with my wife, and how would it affect the quality of my marriage? Because there's a lot of expectations that we have, and then there's a lot of very different things when it comes to reality. I mean, even when it comes to fatherhood, people who don't have children, and then people who do have children, there's just so many things that you learn from experience that you can't really get from books. So those are the points that we're going to end with today. I appreciate everyone joining for the conversation. Jazakallah san al jaza. So just a quick announcement at the end of the stream, which is that we're going to have these, we're kind of doing this as a pilot project, which is going to be every Tuesday at 8 o'clock Eastern time throughout October. The objective is that we just want to kind of casually talk about these different subjects based on personal experience, so that we can just get a different angle of understanding those teachings of Islam that we've learned, that we've grown up with. How do they come into application? How do we find ourselves practicing them, and how do we find it? How can we improve our practice of them? So, Jazakallah everyone for joining, and we're going to close with just some final words from Mutamim Tarbiyat Sahib, Azam Akram Sahib.
Ji, Jazakallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. First of all, I really enjoyed the discussion, and thank you very much for all the panelists for being on and being very candid, being very open. So this is what you're going to expect every Tuesday night at the same time, and we'll try to make sure we get the same link. But please encourage others to join and participate in this conversation. You can DM the panelists and our moderator your comments and your questions. I saw a very healthy activity happening here on YouTube. Please, you can share the link if you want people to gain awareness of how honest of a conversation we're having here. And it's a master class really on how to achieve that successful relationship and what points to think on and ponder on. Jazakallah, Imams Murabi Saab and the panelists. Can you end with a dua, please?
So please join in silent prayer. Ameen.
Jazakallah. Assalamu alaikum.